Okay, hi everyone. Um, Hopefully we'll have a couple more join us as we go, but we can go ahead and get started. So a couple of announcements. Next week is our first exam. I talked about this before, but I'll just recap. It's not going to be a traditional like timed exam. It's going to be a written exam that you'll have several days to complete next week. So it will be open book, open note. I'll send something out about it over the weekend, and you'll have more information about it then. We also will not have a Zoom meeting next week. So we'll skip next week since we don't have any new material. And then you'll just have that time to do your exam. I haven't decided yet when it's going to be open or closed, but you'll have at least 2 or 3 days to work on it, if not a couple more. Okay, so for this week, we had the assigned readings, the 2 Goodrum papers, which were a background of biological anthropology, basically, specifically studies of human evolution. So I have a lecture for you. I'm not sure. I don't think it'll last the entire class, so we can do some discussion when we're done with it, if we have time. But let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. As I'm going along, I have my chat window open, so you're welcome to ask questions or type anything into the chat that you may want to bring up. Okay. So I am going to talk today about historical perspectives from an evolutionary standpoint, from a biological anthropology perspective. So we will get up to towards the end of this class lecture talking a little bit about what the more modern approach is in studying human behavior and human biology, basically, but we'll do a little background before we get to that. So to start with, we're not going to go into nearly as much detail as the articles did. We're going to touch on a few things in here that weren't covered in the article as well. So if we can start in Darwin's time, we'll get to Darwin in just a second, but prior to Darwin's time, as we kind of talked about in the last couple of weeks, there weren't a lot of fact-based approaches to studying human evolution or human biology or anything like that, human prehistory in any way. The governing mindset was still very religiously oriented, with humans being kind of at the top of this great chain of being, with kind of a divine placement. So that's kind of leading up to Darwin's time. Just briefly, Aristotle did some kind of discussions of what early human ancestors may have looked like. Again, he didn't really have like a lot of evolutionary ideas, but he had sort of these ideas that he wrote about why we look the way that we do. So he definitely kind of had this approach that we were all created as is, but for certain reasons. So an example is that he believed that while we do seem very closely related to monkeys and other apes, we lack a tail, obviously, and we have pretty prominent butts. It is the truth. No other primate has a projecting backside like we do. Basically for the reason that our hip and butt muscles are oriented differently. But at any rate, Aristotle proposed that the reason that we lack a tail and that we have prominent butts is to give us a comfortable place to sit when we're tired. Now, this is a perfect example of what we were talking about last week, the just so stories that we talked about in reference to the Gould and Lewontin article. That is a perfect idea. It's a perfect example of a just so story. We see a feature, we don't understand the feature, we come up with a guess about why it exists the way that it does. Now, the reason we really have projecting butts, of course, is, like I said, because of the way that we are bipedal locomotors. Now, in order to stabilize our bodies in an upright position, our gluteal muscles have had to change shape and size and orientation, resulting in this kind of projection of that area of the body that isn't present in quadrupeds. So again, that's a really good example of a just so story that that it kind of existed in the past that we now know to be invalid. Okay, so going into Darwin's time, we talked last week about his views on human evolution and his views on human behavior. He wrote extensively about both of those issues, mostly in his private papers, but in some publicly published documents during his life, a little bit in the Descent of Man. As I talked about last time, his ideas were progressive for his time, but ultimately not correct in many areas. And of course, again, coming back to this point that we always have to keep things in perspective. If Darwin was alive today, we would think that his ideas were retrograde and sexist against women, but at the time they were very much a product of the environment that he lived in. So we can't really judge him by today's standards because he didn't know everything that we know today. So in terms of what was known of the human fossil record, not very much. So the first Neanderthal fossils had been found in that century. There was a fossil that was found in the 1820s that was thought to be human at the time. It was later restudied and kind of reclassified as a Neanderthal. The first known Neanderthal that really came onto the scene was discovered right around the time that On the Origin of Species was published, so in 1856. It was recognized as being something different, but nobody knew exactly what it was. So as far as Darwin's awareness of Neanderthals, later in his life, he was aware of these fossils, but he, like everybody else during that time, had no idea how to interpret them or what they meant. Also, keep in mind that back in this time, there was no way of knowing how old a fossil was. So none of the technology for dating had been invented yet. Now, there was a lot of speculation during Darwin's time about where humans originated. Darwin and some of his circle correctly predicted that human origins would be found in Africa. Others in the scientific community argued that Asia was the location where we would find evidence of human evolution. If you are familiar, those of you that took my 1020 class, if you're familiar and remember back to this section of the course, when Homo erectus was first discovered, Homo erectus was discovered in Southeast Asia in the 1890s. The reason somebody was even over there looking for a fossil is because they thought that human origins would be found in Southeast Asia. So during this time, again, a lot of debate about that, whether Asia or Africa was kind of the seat of humankind. There were also some racists that insisted that Europe would be the location because, of course, they believed Europe to be far superior to anywhere else on the planet and Europeans to be kind of at the apex of human societies. They were obviously completely 100% wrong. But the point is that there was a lot of speculation during this time, and Darwin actually himself argued correctly that brain development and bipedalism were the key elements in human evolution. And we still know this to be the case. These are the two primary things that differentiate us from non-human primates. We have these big brains that have drastically changed our behavior, and we walk bipedally. Now, The Neanderthals that were first discovered in the 19th century are listed here at Angers, which is a French site. That discovery was made in 1820. As I said, it wasn't until much later that anybody recognized it as being something other than human. So that's really the first non-modern human fossil that was ever discovered, that we know of at least. And then, of course, in 1856, the Neanderthal 1 specimen was discovered, which is pictured here on the slide. It was found in Germany in the Neander Valley. So in German, Tal means valley, and it was located in the Neander Valley, so that the term Neanderthal comes from that. Now, when the Neanderthal 1 specimen was discovered, nobody, as I said, knew how to interpret it. There were a lot of anatomists that studied it that made various types of arguments for how to explain what it was. Now, one of the more popular opinions, or one of the stronger opinions of the day, was held by a man named Rudolf Virchow. Rudolf Virchow was a very famous and influential German anatomist and paleontologist. He is often referred to as the father of modern pathology because he was actually really instrumental in determining what actually causes diseases to some extent. Now, he didn't know anything about germs necessarily, but he really fought against and discredited the idea of something called humorism, which is the idea that imbalanced humors cause illness. So he was really well respected and held a lot of sway. And he was, like I said, instrumental in bringing medicine into the realm of science. He also did some early work on public health. Now, he was a staunch anti-evolutionist. So he kind of fell into this pattern of European scientists during this time period, that these anti-evolutionist scientists in Europe, where they were opposed to evolution, but not necessarily for religious reasons. So if you remember, George Cuvier was another one of these individuals, very powerful, influential scientists in Europe in this time in the 19th century, who was also anti-evolution. Now, neither of these people were religious. They basically argued that there wasn't enough evidence in the fossil record for evolutionary change. So while they were anti-evolutionists, it wasn't for religious reasons. Rudolf Virchow famously publicly called Darwin an ignoramus. So that was his take on Darwin's ideas, which, you know, nobody knows who Rudolf Virchow is now, and everybody knows who Darwin is. So who's the ignoramus? At any rate, he was important in this story of Neanderthals because he spent a lot of time studying the Neanderthals. And again, as an anti-evolutionist, he basically had this burden of proof where he was trying to make an argument for why these are anatomically modern humans and not a different species. And basically, since he was an expert in pathology or diseases, he came up with a whole long list of pathological conditions that could explain the weird-looking anatomy. He believed that, for example, the curvature in the femora, so your thigh bone here, this on the left-hand side is a human thigh bone. On the right-hand side, this is a reproduction of a Neanderthal thigh bone. The Neanderthal thigh bone is, I know it's kind of hard to tell from this angle, but it's very curved, whereas the human femur is pretty straight. There's a lot of curvature to the Neanderthal femur. Now, for example, one of the ways that he kind of wanted to explain away this anatomy is that he argued that the curvature to the femora was due to rickets, aka osteomyelitia. Now, rickets, if you aren't familiar with that condition, it's caused by a severe vitamin D deficiency. It causes curvature to the leg bones. As you can see here, this is a young child's x-ray showing the curvature to both the thighs and the lower legs. basically what happens here is that the bones are losing their mineral component. So your bones are made up of a mineral component and a soft tissue component. And what happens when someone has a vitamin D deficiency is that you don't get adequate calcium built up in your bones. So the end result, if this happens over a long period of time, is that your bones are soft. So if you're walking around, even as a young child, if you're walking around and your bones aren't strong enough, essentially they're going to bend and deform over time. So someone who has rickets, it's a result of this lack of calcium in their bones. So what he explained was basically that the reason these bones are curved is because these individuals had rickets, not because they were something other than human. Now, what we understand now is that while rickets definitely causes curvature to the lower limbs, it happens in very predictable ways when it comes to rickets. And you can see here on the slide how this looks. Like they curve in this kind of mediolateral way. So you end up with this bow-legged effect where the knees are kind of far away from each other and the curvature is kind of this round shape that you see on the slide here. That is not how the Neanderthal thigh bones are curved. They're curved front to back. So the curvature that's present is nothing like the curvature that's present in a rickets case. So in terms of what causes this in Neanderthals, it probably has to do with the muscularity. Neanderthals were very, very muscular in terms of their body mass. So it's probably like a biomechanical effect of having really, really powerful thigh muscles. So that gives you an idea. All of this anatomy was explained away in various ways. So over the next 30 or so years, a lot more material was unearthed, and Virchow never wavered in his conviction. He never agreed with the rest of the scientific community. He always argued that these were pathological modern humans. But again, so there was debate. Nobody really knew what to make of them. Even scientists who believed that they might not be human, they didn't know what they were or how old they were, et cetera, et cetera. So jumping forward a little, in 1908, this specimen on the slide was discovered in France. This is a specimen called La Chapelle. It is a very famous specimen. It's now referred to as the Old Man of La Chapelle. It was discovered in a cave site in France, like many others. And as you can see, there's some interesting looking anatomy here. The brow ridges are much more prominent than you would expect to see in a modern human. We've got some other pathologies. We're also missing a lot of teeth here. Now, when this was discovered, it was rightly assumed to be a Neanderthal. So basically, there were some reconstructions that were created based on this individual. This is what the reconstructions look like. This drawing is especially heinous. That is nothing like a Neanderthal ever would have looked. That's more like, I mean, if I had to pick an actual species that was most similar to, I would say Lucy's species, but even then it's not super close. At any rate, these are some other reconstructions that were done based on the Old Man of La Chapelle specimen. So Boole, this man, Marcelin Boole, was an artist who worked for some museums in Europe during this time period, and he reconstructed this specimen, the Old Man of La Chapelle, for dioramas in museums. And these are his reconstructions that were used in the dioramas. So as you can see, these individuals look better than the drawing, obviously, but they still look pretty primitive. They look pretty brutish, not very civilized, not very much like humans. Now, the reason that these reconstructions were made the way that they are is because La Chapelle is not a good specimen to make a reproduction based on. So this individual, even though he's called the Old Man of La Chapelle, was probably only in his 40s when he died. He was in very poor health. He had many partially healed fractures. He had arthritis. He had skeletal lesions. He had, as I said, missing teeth here. The teeth had they hadn't just fallen out. They had been gone for quite some time. There's like, resorption of the bone here. So this individual was not a healthy individual. It was an older individual, and it gave a really incorrect idea of what Neanderthals were like. So these constructions really imply that Neanderthals are dumb and they're brutish and primitive. And these ideas have really carried through to today. A lot of people, a lot of lay people, if they hear the term Neanderthal, or as it's usually called Neanderthal in kind of public circles, they just assume that it's meant to be kind of an insult, like these are dumb, brutish, unsophisticated pre-humans. And this is really not the case. So it hasn't been until the last maybe 10 or 15 years that we've really begun to change our minds about Neanderthals and what they were like. So moving away from the biases that were kind of caused by Boole and his reconstructions, we now know, of course, that Neanderthals were very similar to modern humans in terms of their anatomy, more similar than this, and that they were also much more sophisticated. So in terms of their behavior, we know that they used sophisticated weapons. We know that they consumed marine resources, fish and shellfish, which is a sophisticated way of retrieving food. It requires high-tech weapons. We know that their brain size, of course, is actually larger on average than modern humans. That doesn't mean that they are more intelligent, because we're not exactly sure about their actual brain function. But we have no reason to think that they were this kind of stupid, lumbering, primitive species like they were thought to be in the past. So what this brings up is the question, again, coming back to kind of the theme of the class, what constitutes unique human behavior? Because we know that Neanderthals were engaging in a lot of the behaviors that we consider to be uniquely human. So rituals, sophisticated tool use, that exploitation of marine resources, all of these things are considered to be human-like behaviors, and we know that Neanderthals were doing them. So it's something that we need to really keep in mind moving forward, that not only do humans have this kind of unique set of behaviors that differentiate us from other living apes, but our direct ancestors and some of our cousins in our evolutionary history also shared the same traits. So there's behaviors that I'm sure are completely unique to humans, like the degree to which we use tools and modify our environments and things like that. But baseline, very similar behaviors seen in our close relatives. Now, moving forward out of Darwin's time, well, before we get out of Darwin's time, let's backtrack just a minute. The overarching theme of biological anthropology, or physical anthropology as it was called, until pretty recently, was just an absolute obsession with race. The field has really tried to move away from this racial typology, because it has such kind of a dirty and unpleasant history to it. But we can't really talk about modern perspectives until we understand where we're coming from. So back in the Renaissance, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit in previous discussions, but real discussions of race didn't really begin until the Renaissance. So when European ships began to sail around to distant parts of the earth, they would bring back reports of people who looked differently and behaved much differently. In some cases, they would kidnap those people and bring them back to Europe. Now, this started an interest in among taxonomists and categorizing people. So this was, around the time of Linnaeus. There was already an obsession in the scientific community with classification and taxonomy. So this just extended to categorizing humans as well. around this time, Blumenbach, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, he was a follower and student of Linnaeus. So we're talking about like the late 18th century here, moving into the early 19th. Blumenbach used a lot of Linnaeus's methods of classification, but he was really focused on classifying human diversity. So he collected hundreds of skulls from around the world. I don't really have any information on where he got these skulls, but I would assume the worst. So he had all these collections of skulls, and he was classifying them based on measurements and overall kind of appearances of the shapes of the skulls. Now, from this study, he concluded that there were 5 races of people, and he included in these 5 races are what we would today consider European, African, Asian, American Indian, and Southeast Asian. For whatever reason, he categorized Asian and Southeast Asian as 2 different groups. He believed that these populations were static and would not change over time. So that it was kind of like this Aristotelian view of everything existing as it always has. So as we move into the 19th century, a lot of naturalists who were interested, like Blumenbach, in analyzing where humans came from, were kind of divided. They were divided into 2 different groups, the monogenists and the polygenists. Now, these terms are kind of briefly brought up in the first Goodrun article, but there's not a lot said about it. So basically, the monogenists believed that all humans share a very recent common ape-like ancestor. So they believed, the take-home message from that is that they believed that all humans were of the same species. This is obviously what we know to be true today. They also, so they believe that humans constitute a single species with a recent common ancestry. Excuse me. This was still before a lot was known about, this was before any Darwin's ideas. So that really wasn't in the public sphere yet. One thing that they did kind of bring in was a religious element. The mechanism that the monogenists used to explain the existence of modern races was the dispersion of Noah's descendants after the Great Flood. So the biblical flood happened, Noah's descendants spread out and recolonized the world and kind of change into different things or different looking people, different groups after that happens. Now, interestingly, I feel like this is kind of interesting because this includes some Darwinian reasoning, even though this was before Darwin. So they believe that these descendants of Noah spread out into different climates and that the environment caused people to change physically and culturally. So they were kind of right for the wrong reasons, you might say. So in the same vein, like there was a lot discussed about the diversity of language. They believed that, again, relying heavily on biblical stories, they believed that after the Tower of Babel incident, that's when kind of God instantaneously made all of these different languages in different parts of the world. So that's the monogenists. The idea has basically stayed the same with the religious aspects taken out of it since then. Again, the kind of main thrust of the argument being that we're all the same species with recent common ancestry. Now, the polygenists during this time really heavily hinged on Blumenbach's work. So they believed that each race of humans, of which there were 3, were descended from a different ape-like ancestor. So in this worldview, they believed that Europeans were descended from a chimp-like ancestor, that Africans were descended from a gorilla-like ancestor, and that Asians were descended from an orangutan-like ancestor. Now, this doesn't even have any internal logic because if it had any internal logic, Europeans would be descended from a European ape, but there are no European apes. Chimps are also from Africa. So it doesn't make any sense. Shocker, it's wrong. So they believed, something that tied in with this polygenist idea is that different races are different species, and therefore it becomes a justification for slavery. If you don't view other races as being human in the same way you are, it becomes a lot easier and a lot more morally defensible to do horrible things to them. So these are all kind of cultural aspects that are rolling in together, that kind of are obviously toxic and very wrong. Thankfully, the monogenists won out in the end, and again, kind of tinkered with that to take out the religious aspect, but it's basically the same idea. But unfortunately, like until maybe the 1960s, there were still fringe scholars that were writing about human races being different subspecies. Nobody who was a legitimate scientist believed that, but as I said, there were fringe people kind of on the fringe of science that were writing articles like that into the 1960s. So physical anthropology, also known as biological anthropology, up until probably 5 to 10 years ago, the term was always physical anthropology. There's been a shift in the last few years towards renaming the field biological anthropology, simply because I think they want to have more of a focus on like biological processes as they affect humans. So that's something that's relatively new. But if you've taken other anthropology classes, and I know some of you have, one of the kind of founding fathers of physical anthropology is, of course, Franz Boas. Franz Boas came around kind of in the early to mid 20th century. During this time, there were other scholars like Ernest Houghton or Alice Hrdlicka who were doing physical anthropology and kind of in some ways doing valuable work, but also really were focused on race, like just obsessed with race. Now, Franz Boas came around and he really wanted to push back against racist approaches. So a lot of the work that was being done by these more racist anthropologists were focused on looking at physical traits that, I'm sure they wouldn't have admitted this, but physical traits that supported the idea that non-white populations were not as good as white populations. That was kind of the whole worldview. Franz Boas came in and he argued really strongly that biology wasn't really supporting any of these racial typologies. So what he did was he argued essentially the other side of the nature versus nurture argument. He argued that a lot of the differences that we see between ethnic groups and cultures are due to environmental differences, differences in culture in general, and not a reflection of any kind of biological fact or anything like that. Now, Franz Boas, the way that he went about this was he measured, I think, something like 20,000 skulls, not just of dead individuals, but living individuals too. He had kind of a campaign going to measure people's heads. He would measure recent immigrants, second generation, third generation. He had this huge collection of data about skull shape. And what he found was that there really is no discernible difference in skull shapes from population to population, at least that you could tell from living people. So he was again pushing back, like really strongly pushing back against using racial typologies to try to explain anything about human behavior. So he kind of ushered in this new era, the modern era of the field, which was much less focused on typology and classification and much more focused on using evolutionary theory, like hardcore legitimate evolutionary theory, to studying humans. So race is something that is very much avoided as a whole in the field, which, and you know, those of you that have taken osteology or forensics know this, but race is not even a term that's used in the field anymore. This is like a term that basically doesn't exist in legitimate circles in the field. And the reason is because based on Franz Boas and others, we know that there are no biological races. This is not something that exists in nature. We know that there are culturally defined races, but no biologically defined races. So we've kind of gone as far in the opposite direction to the other end of the spectrum as we possibly can as a field in avoiding these racial typologies and avoiding any kind of biological justification for racial kind of categorization or anything. That said, there are certain patterns of skull morphology, as most of you probably know, that vary from population to population. So a forensic anthropologist who is brought in by the police to analyze a set of remains will be able to tell what that individual's ancestry is based on tooth morphology, the shape of the eye sockets, the shape of the nose. Those are things that do differ slightly from population to population geographically. That's not to say that that corresponds with racial categories, because it doesn't. It's more of like a smooth gradient of variation over vast geographic spaces. The other thing that I'll say, one of the other reasons that we as a field avoid this kind of discussion of race is especially because of some of the earlier members of the field. Their work was used to justify things like eugenics and sterilization programs and stuff like that. So nothing good has come from it, and that's the primary reason that we don't. There's no point in it. It's not biologically relevant, and it's led to a lot of really bad things that have happened historically. Okay, so in terms of studying human behaviors, after we have our exam next week, we're going to move into different approaches to studying human behavior. So we're going to do kind of a survey. Depending on what other classes you've taken in like biology or anything like that, or zoology maybe, some of you may have heard of some of these terms, but there are different approaches to studying human behavior. So there's things like sociobiology, there is human behavioral ecology, there's evolutionary psychology. So as we move into this kind of modern era of studies of human behavior, we're going to focus more on different approaches to studying human behavior from for the last like 50 or so years. One of the things that we kind of mentioned earlier in the semester was the evolutionary psychology perspective. The evolutionary psychology perspective basically holds that our psychological processes evolved in a certain type of environment that we no longer live in. So our behavior is kind of pre-programmed for that old environment, and that kind of explains why some of our behavior is so nonsensical in modern times. So that's like an example. That's only one of the examples, but we will kind of move more into that now that we're up to the modern era. Okay, that is about all I have for you for today. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Okay, like I said, I will be sending out an announcement on Sunday, most likely, with more information about the exam, what the dates that it'll be open and all of that kind of stuff. As I said, it's not going to be, it's going to be open book written exam, so it shouldn't be too stressful or anything like that. So if nobody has any other questions, we can go ahead and end this a little bit early. And I will see you all in 2 weeks. Okay, bye.
Thank you.